How we doing this morning? We doing okay? I really appreciated last week. Pastor Britta was like, it's like the first day of school and everything's a little bit different. For me, it was always the second week of school. I was always like, okay, like I had all the jitters and the anxiousness and the excitement, right? But then the second week, I was like, I don't know if I want to keep doing this rhythm. Here we are in the second week of Lent, and you made it. Well done, well done. If you kind of paid attention in the order of service, we're going to be talking about breath prayer. And so what I want you to do for just a moment is just to take a nice big deep breath. You ready? Okay, let's take another one. One last one. You know what's crazy about that? I found out that when you focus on your breathing, it's actually a form of regulation. And that if you're feeling anxious or you're fearful or something is going on, if you take some nice deep breaths, you actually have a chance to slow your heart rate and be more present to what's happening in front of you. Isn't that incredible? God built into our bodies that if we just take a moment and focus on our breath to slow down, we can actually regulate what's happening inside of ourselves. Whatever is going on around us, that it just helps us to center. So I'm going to invite you one more time to do a nice big deep breath. Now, we're going to start off kind of with a question for you. Have you ever had a really good intention, but then kind of in follow through, you've maybe been a little bit lacking? Can anybody relate to that? Just me? Okay, good. Yeah, I have a problem in which I sometimes have a good intention, I don't have great follow through, right? So sometimes we don't have great follow through. Any fellow book collectors out there? Now, yeah, okay. Let me explain before we all claim this book collection. I'm not talking about reading. I'm talking about collecting a book that looks good. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, I heard the That was I just have to say, that's the most amen I've ever gotten from this congregation. I feel that one, right? Like there's something, you read the synopsis and it's like, oh, that looks so good. Or the cover's like, oh my goodness, I can't wait to read that book. And what does it do? Sits on your shelf. It looks so good. I have this great intention. I know this is going to be a great way for me to kind of grow or to read this great story that's right in front of me and follow through. It just sits there. It sits on the shelf. When I was a kid, I can't believe I'm going to admit this. When I was a kid, I loved to read. And this is the kind of geek that I am. I created a Dewey Decimal System for my books. I absolutely did. At the end of my bed, I had 3 bookshelves that I created a Dewey Decimal System to organize all of my books. This is who I am as a person. I'm sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry. It just explains a lot, right? This is who I am. So I had this Dewey Decimal System. I had a spot for a book that was like the highlight book, right? That wasn't in the organizational system, but it sat somewhere else on the shelf as kind of the special place of honor, right? Now, our librarians do an incredible job of actually doing those kinds of things. They actually do use the Dewey Decimal System. So I had this spot in my room for this book to highlight. And the book that I chose to highlight for pretty much the whole time was this book called The Book of Virtues. Does anybody remember those kinds of books that were like, right? They were like, Book of Virtues are like Aesop's fables. It was that kind of thing. And so each chapter in the book was like a different virtue, and it told a story about those things, and then it was like a way that you could grow in your virtues. And so as a kid, again, I was a strange kid. I had the Dewey Decimal System in my room, for goodness sakes. I was like, this is a great idea. I want to grow in virtues. I had heard about virtues, so I'm going to, this is a really good intention. It's going to be the book of highlight. Guess how many virtues I got through? Half. And you know what it was? Patience. I didn't have patience for patience. I had such good intention. I was like, oh, this is such a good idea, but my follow through, my practice, it didn't work, right? I had all of these great intentions. Oh, this is going to be so good, but it became a book that just sat on my shelf and looked pretty. In our faith, I think sometimes we have really good intentions to grow spiritually. And I wonder, how often do those practices become things that sit on our shelf and look pretty? Right? I have found this to be so true in my own life. I desire to grow spiritually. I desire to have a deeper relationship with God and with each other in spiritual community. And a lot of times that sounds really nice and it looks really pretty as it sits on the shelf in my room. And I've only gotten halfway through a chapter. And so a big reason why we've changed our space this morning and why we're intentionally carving out space to do a practice, which is a little bit different, right, from our sermonizing, where a lot of times you hear someone kind of talk with you, but sometimes more at you. And so then you're just kind of internalizing or filling these things, is because I think a lot of times we have really good intention in our faith. We really desire to grow spiritually. But at least for me, I will admit that a lot of times I Dewey Decimal System my practices, but I don't ever actually take them off the shelf. And so what we're trying to do here in this space and creating this space to connect with God and with one another is to allow you some space to really practice these things. And not every practice is going to connect with you. Not everything, you're not going to have an aha moment every morning, or maybe you will, I don't know. That's up to God. But I really do think that one of the ways that we're doing this is to create that space for you to connect most deeply with God. And so that these things wouldn't be just something that we say look good, that we collect these books, but that we actually take them off the shelf and we get into them and we feel them and we experience them and practice them in our own life. And so one of the things in our faith that I think is a big culprit for this idea of really good intention, again, I will only own for myself, I won't say it for you, but is prayer. Right? One of the best intentioned phrases I think in the church is, I'll pray for you. Right? Oof. Well, as I was thinking about that this morning, I was like, oh man. Now, before I want to make one caveat. This congregation does an incredible job of praying for one another. You all, this community is bathed in prayer. You care for each other. You love each other in prayer. That is absolutely true. But I'm kind of talking on kind of a more general level. You know that, like when you say, how you doing? Right? Kind of in general talk. Most often, do we really mean how you doing? Like we don't actually hear the person respond. It's just kind of a thing that we say. And so I'm kind of more talking in the general terms that a lot of times in faith communities, it can be easy to say, well, I'll be praying for you, but do we actually follow through on that? I have a pastor friend who described this practice that he picked up where he said, I was always feeling so guilty because there were so many different people that were asking for prayer, and I never felt like I could really get to all of them. And so instead of saying, I will pray for you, right then he'd pray for them. Either he'd pray for them in person or he'd go off and pray right then because he felt so guilty, he felt so bad that he wasn't actually praying for people because they had all these different requests. Right? So we have really good intention with prayer. The other thing that you often hear when we talk about prayer in the church is that phrase or that passage, pray without ceasing, right? Praying with never stopping. And that sounds really good. That's an incredible intention. But doing that in practice, I don't know about you, but for me, that verse is a lot more like, remember that you stopped praying, right? Like, shoot, like I didn't continue to be in this practice of prayer. And so what I'm really hoping this morning is that what we're going to talk about prayer and we're going to get into these things is it's an opportunity for us to actually maybe a little bit more realistically engage in what does it really mean for us to pray without ceasing, right? And there are all different kinds of prayer, right? There's intercessory prayer, which is praying for other people. There's prayer of confession, where we come before God, confessing the things that keep us separated from God or break the relationship. There are prayers for healing. There are prayers for Thanksgiving. There are all different kinds of prayer, right? So, and all of these types of prayer are so good and so important. And I think what happens is we get kind of, at least for me, I get kind of overwhelmed with the amount of kinds of things to pray for or the kind of weight of what prayer actually is, that it becomes kind of this overwhelming ought to or should or an obligation. And I think in part that's because we've kind of made prayer, we've upended the way we've understood prayer. And so the way I want to think about prayer this morning is a really simple definition. We're going to kind of flip it on its head a little bit, and the foundation of prayer. And so I want us to think about the foundation of prayer. And the foundation of prayer is this really simple definition. Prayer at its absolute core is communion with God. Okay, prayer at its absolute core, I think, is this idea of communion with God. And part of the reason I think that prayer is really, really helpful and really is important for us to get is that I think sometimes we have all of these ideas of what we ought to do or these kind of obligations. I should be praying for people or I should be thanking God. And those things are absolutely true. But I think those things pour out of the reality that when we have focused on our dwelling with God, our being in communion with God, those things naturally outpour. And so I think what we often do is we talk about prayer being all this kind of list of things, this list of information that we bring to God, and then we'll get to the kind of deeper part at some point. And I think the invitation for us this morning is we want to start to kind of foster that foundation of communion with God that sometimes doesn't even have words. Or maybe it has very simple words, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And from that place then, these other forms of prayer, of praying for one another, of praying for healing, those things kind of naturally outpour from this relationship, this connection with God. Does that inverse kind of make sense? Amen. Thank you, Brenda. And so the passage that's going to kind of root us in this idea is a passage that comes from Psalm 62, and it's these two verses that are pretty straightforward, but I'll just unpack very briefly before we move into our practice. And so Psalm 62 says this: "Truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken." Take a deep breath. Truly my soul finds rest in God. As I was reading that this week in preparation for our time together, I actually found myself struck for a moment and said, truly my soul found rest in God. Truly? I kind of found myself asking that question, does my soul truly find rest in God? Do I truly believe that to be true? Because I think this repeated phrase then in verse 2, truly he is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, I will never be shaken. That makes so much sense to me. I can kind of assent to that intellectually. But truly my soul finding rest in God, I was really caught by, how does my soul find rest? What does that look like? And so because of who I am as a person, I went back to the original language, because it's really interesting to me to try to figure out what exactly does that mean, that truly my soul finds rest in God. And the word that's used for finds rest in God is used only 3 other times in the Psalms. And so to know what finding rest in God is, this particular word, how it's defined as a little fuzzy because there's not very many occurrences to know exactly what was meant. But of the other occurrences of this word of our soul finding rest in God, it has this connotation of stillness, of waiting, of stopping, of things ceasing. Truly my soul waits for God. Truly my soul stops in God. Truly my soul ceases from striving in God. Have you ever seen those scenes in a movie where the time starts to slow down and then the rain just all of a sudden is hung in motion? Has anybody ever seen a movie like that where time stops, right? It's that moment of time stopping. Or have you ever been to a lake on a really calm morning? And it's not like the water is stagnant, right? There are things that have caused it to move, but when it's still, it's like the surface of the lake is like glass. And you can see all the way to the bottom. Truly my soul finds stillness in God. It's like the surface of our life, the surface of our lake, gets stilled enough. It's at rest. That's why it says my soul finds rest in God. It is at rest. It has stopped seeking and striving. And that is the place that our soul finds itself with God, in the stillness of the surface, so that we can see the depths of what we're being invited to. Ruth Haley Barton, in her book that describes these spiritual practices, she talks about spiritual transformation like this. She says, let me pull it up. Daryl, you can pull it up for me. Thank you. I have it here too, but she says this. She says, choosing a way of life that opens us to the presence of God in the places of our being where our truest desires and deepest longings stir. I'll admit that's like a mouthful and a brainful. So I'm going to read that again. And this is kind of getting at what I'm hoping we're being invited to this morning, which is our soul coming to stop in the presence of God. So she says, spiritual transformation, the process of our actually living out this intention. We desire to grow spiritually, but what does that really look like for us to be transformed spiritually? She defines it like this. It's choosing a way of life, the way we structure our life, how we operate, that opens us to the presence of God in the places of our being where our truest desires and deepest longings stir. That for me was such a helpful invitation to think about prayer in the context of allowing my soul to stop enough, to stop striving enough, to cease enough, to wait and to rest in God. That I would be in connection with God with my truest desires and my deepest longings. And in a lot of ways, I think that the passage we're kind of looking at all of Lent is Jesus going out into the wilderness. And I think in a lot of ways, this is the kind of work that's happening in Jesus, or the kind of space that Jesus is creating, right? Jesus is drawing away. We hear of Jesus drawing away often in prayer. And here he draws into the wilderness and opening himself up to the presence of God, to this place where everything else is stripped away, right? He's fasting, he's in this space, and everything else is stripped away. And so he becomes intimately connected and deeply connected to God, the Creator. Now, something that's really interesting, I think, is when Jesus goes into the wilderness, we never hear that he actually utters a prayer, right? We never hear the words that Jesus prayed in the wilderness. But I don't know about you, but I would be shocked if Jesus wasn't in prayer often when he was in the wilderness. But we never actually hear the words that Jesus prays, but we know that Jesus is deeply and intimately connected to the Father. And this is the kind of prayer that I want to invite us to this morning. It's this kind of deep, guttural prayer. This prayer that gets to the very heart and actually what I'm going to call this morning the gut of our prayer. It gets to the core of who we are. And it is from that place that often there are not words, or there are very simple words, that we are in communion with God, where our soul stops enough, it rests enough into the presence of God and communion with God to be honest and vulnerable with God in our deepest longings and our deepest desires. So as Ruth Haley Barton, she talks about this spiritual practice called breath prayer. I was really grateful because I've practiced this practice before. And in this practice, a lot of times you hear, think of a word or a phrase and just kind of breathe that in rhythm, which is ultimately what we're going to do. But what I really appreciated about how Ruth Haley Barton frames this idea of breath prayer is she gives you some steps to connect with how you might come up with that word or that phrase. What exactly is it that we're being asked to pray, or how are we being invited into that kind of rhythm of prayer? And so she talks about this breath prayer as being crying out from the gut. Now, if you've heard me preach before, you know that one of my favorite words in the Bible is this word splagizomai, which is a Greek word, which means from the gut. Because a lot of times I think when we think about prayer, we think cerebrally, right, from the head. So a lot of times we're praying a list of something, or we're praying of prayer for God, so we do a lot of the praying from our head. We also do a lot of praying kind of from our heart. We have a heart for people, so we're praying for people, or we're reaching out for someone to be healed or to be well or to care for something that's going on in their life. But the kind of prayer that Ruth is inviting us into in the idea of breath prayer is going even deeper into the gut. You know when we often talk about like you have a gut feeling? Like, there's a gut about that. It's about getting deeply connected to something in yourself that just kind of goes even kind of beyond words or description. And words help us get to that place, but it's this kind of in the very core of who we are. You can't even fully articulate or perhaps grasp exactly what it is that you're being asked to, but there's something deeply in you that is a space that you can connect with God. And so what Ruth Haley Barton's encouragement is as we find ourselves kind of slowing ourselves down enough, finding rest, our soul finding rest in God, that we would be open to having that kind of vulnerability with God. And from that place of vulnerability, all of the other forms of prayer and all of the other practices, instead of being on a shelf, right, of things that look good, we actually can start to experience this spiritual transformation within our own life. And so I'm going to lead us through this practice of breath prayer, of getting kind of centered into the gut of our prayer, and invite you into kind of discovering some different ways, some words that might come that would help you. And the practice, again, is at its core, is to focus on your breathing. It's to pay attention that the presence of God is closer to you than your very breath. And as you breathe in and you breathe out, you kind of set your breath to a rhythm of a prayer, and it's repeated many, many times. And the reason that you do that is so that you don't have to think too much about it. We do the work now in this practice of getting to that place. But once you've done that, that it becomes a practice that you can pray at any time. So this idea of praying without ceasing, I think is at its core, we focus on our breath. We're intentional with what our breath is inviting us to. And so we'll have some invitations communally that I'll talk about at the end of the practice. But how this practice is going to work is you will first start, and we're just going to seek to quiet ourselves in the presence of God. I will play the piano because I know for me, I don't mind quiet, but for some it can feel like this is a little bit intimidating. I also want to just name, going to a place of kind of connecting to your deep gut can feel pretty vulnerable. One of the things that I think Ruth Haley Barton talks about in praying this way of kind of connecting with the deepest part of ourselves is a lot of times it's a vulnerable place, and so we feel like we're out of control. And so it can be a hard place to go. And so I want to recognize this morning, this may not be the space for you to kind of get really deep into your gut. You may need to kind of experience this practice communally together, and that's why we have these cards so that you can bring it home, and if it's like, I would need to do some more work on this, you have that opportunity. But I also want to say that what we really want to invite you to is, can you get to the place that we slow our breathing down enough, we slow ourselves enough that we're paying attention to the presence of God with us. So we'll first spend about 4-ish minutes and just quiet. And I'll just invite you to kind of focus on your breathing. And the second thing then is that you will imagine Jesus calling to us by name, saying your name in your own mind, and then asking you, what do you want? And a really important part of asking what do you want is that I think a lot of times when we're asked that question, we feel like we shouldn't give an honest response. Because either we have judgment like, well, I shouldn't want that thing, or it feels like, well, I don't know what I want. Because how often in your life, are you asked at kind of a core level, what is it that you want? And so the invitation for you is when Jesus asks you that question, what do you want? I want to invite you to answer that question without judgment. And what can be helpful is, as you're thinking about those things, to maybe be jotting those down in a journal or if on the kind of side of this page, to just some words or phrases. What are the things that I want? What am I feeling deeply within myself? And then in the kind of third step, what we're going to do is you're going to work with those words or phrases until you've kind of gotten to what feels like, as Ruth talks about, it captures your desire as truly as possible right now. So if perhaps kind of a deep piece of that, of capturing truly, is maybe I feel I have a need for safety, or I have a need for love, or for me, I will admit I need to work on how I understand grace. And so what you're trying to do is kind of work with some of the things of how you would respond to Jesus with what you want to get to, is there something deeper there? Is there a deeper meaning, a deeper desire beneath those initial desires? Then the fourth thing that we'll do is we'll choose kind of an image for God or a word or a name for God that will be kind of your anchor point. And so that can be words like Jesus, Father, Abba. It can also be images like a shepherd or like a mother hen who gathers her chicks under her wings. So maybe a picture comes to mind for you, but what's the way that really feels like a favorite image for you of how you understand your relationship with God? And then what you'll do is you'll take those two things, kind of the deep need, the longing that you have kind of nestled in the gut of your being, and the word or the image that you have for God, and put those things together in a way that's easier for you to breathe. So some examples that she gives are, here I am, Lord. Here I am, Lord. Or, Jesus, I love you. Or, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. So if it's a little bit long, you can kind of phrase it out in a couple of different breaths. And so what we're seeking to do is to find a word or a phrase that's at its core connects with something in your gut. And from that place then, you're really making it very simple so that as you breathe, you can breathe it into the different places in your life. I have been dealing a lot with anxiety in my own life. And so when I'm anxious, I find if I can center on my breathing and I pray a really simple prayer, it helps to bring me kind of to my gut, to my core. Perhaps there's a moment when you're feeling like, I just really need God's presence in this space. It's a simple way for you to pray. And the invitation we'll do communally is that once you feel like you've landed on a breath prayer, that you can pray that at the start of your day, at noon, and as you go to sleep. Just as a way to remember that all of our community, those who choose to do this practice, are doing these things together, and that you're not alone in these kinds of prayers. So we're going to enter into this space of giving you just some time to be quiet and to still your soul, and then you're going to focus on hearing these different steps, and I'll walk these things through. Okay, is this making sense for the most part? Okay. Again, I recognize that this can seem a little bit like abstract or maybe more foreign. And so this is a chance for you just to enter into this space with God. If you just need to sit and close your eyes and take a nap, that's what God has for you this morning. So I want you to find a spot to be comfortable. If you need to kind of move around, maybe plant your feet a little bit so that you feel like you're a little bit more centered on where you are, that you feel relaxed. If you need to lean back, if you need to lay down, you're welcome to do that. But I really want to invite you to kind of relax your body and spend some time focusing on your breath. And just breathe in and breathe out. And stay in that comfortable posture for just a few moments. Breathe in and breathe out. If it's helpful, maybe even hold that image of a lake being stilled from the wind, or kind of everything coming to a stop. And just hold that in your mind as you quiet yourself before God in these moments. As you keep focusing on your breath, I want you to imagine if Jesus were to call you by name and ask you your name, Paul, what do you want? How would you respond to that question? If it's helpful, maybe write some of those things down on a piece of paper and keep writing until you feel you've been able to identify something really significant for you that you want. And try to do this without judgment. Spend a few moments working with those words or phrases until you feel like it really captures your desire as truly as possible right now. So if there's some way to kind of summarize what it is you're feeling are your desires, this deepest longing in your gut, how could you write that in just a few words? set that just aside for just a second as you choose your favorite name or image for God, as you're finding yourself relating to God right now. This could be a specific word like creator or father, and it could also be an image like a shepherd or a mother hen. Spend just a moment thinking about the favorite image you have for how you relate to God. Take a moment to combine the name you have for God with the expression of your deep longing. It's helpful to place this where it's easiest to say in the rhythm of your breathing. Here I am, Lord. Jesus, I love you. Lord Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. And if coming up with these words or phrases is difficult for you, I invite you to think about one of the ways that psalm invites us to find rest in God. Perhaps it's, may my soul stop in God. May my soul stop striving in God. But sit for a moment and see if you can put together that favorite image of God with that deep longing. As you're able, and as you feel comfortable, I want to invite you now for just a few more moments to focus on that prayer. If for you this was difficult and you feel you just need to focus on your breathing, you can simply just focus on breathing in and out. If you have that word and that phrase, I invite you to center yourself as you breathe that into these spaces for just the next few moments. As you breathe in and you breathe out. So God, we do pray that as we focus on our breath, that you would help us to continue to find these spaces to slow and to stop, that our soul might find rest in you. May you continue to call us to this calm and quiet place in you. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Amen. As is our practice in Lent, one of the things we want to invite you to is, as you feel comfortable, to perhaps share a little bit about how this experience was for you. It could be really life-giving for you. It could be frustrating, and anything in between. And also recognizing that connecting to those deep places can sometimes feel like, I don't know if I'd want to share too much about that. And so we don't want to encourage you to share something you don't feel comfortable with, but to maybe talk about the process or what the breath prayer is like for you, without needing to necessarily talk about the specifics or talking about the specifics as you feel ready. And so because of that, one of the things I want to invite you to, if you are hearing impaired and you'd prefer to talk out in the narthex, you are welcome to do that. But I think I'd love to have you in a smaller group at your table. So either in a pair or a triad or a small group, so maybe your table splits in half, to process a little bit about what this practice was like for you. The questions we'll have, Daryl, can you pull those back up just so we can see those? Is you'll talk to each other about what prayer is like for you these days in general. How does it resonate with what we talked about this morning? How does it feel like maybe it's changing or shifting? And then what has it been like for you to sit in the stillness and begin to listen for your breath prayer this morning? And again, tell each other as little or as much as you'd wish about your breath prayer. And you can speak about prayer in general also in both of those spaces. So I want to give you a moment to go ahead and find a small group of people to connect with. If you want to stay in the room, that's great. If you want to move, that's great. And I will give you we'll only do about 5 minutes of this today, just to kind of keep it a little bit tighter and get you all out. So go ahead and move as you need to.